Hello, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. I'm here with Bante Sudaso and I'm Aya Somam. Welcome to another Sangha Panel. Today is just going to be the two of us here at Empty Cloud, and the topic will be on gender. So maybe I'll invite Bante Sudaso, since I can't really invite myself, to say a few words on the topic for tonight.
We can start by paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll make some opening remarks and get us started. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Well, so the topic of gender in Buddhism. In order to talk about this, we need to define two words. We need to define the word gender and the word Buddhism, and then we can have some conversation on the topic. So first off, Buddhism. What is Buddhism? In the briefest sense, Buddhism is the practice of becoming awakened. It's the practice of relinquishing greed, hatred, and delusion so that we can have a clear, undistorted, direct perception of the true nature of reality. It's the practice of gradually purifying the mind of all wrong view and misperceptions of things. And the Buddha specifically targeted three wrong views in particular. So the wrong view of permanence, the wrong view of happiness through conditional things, so conditional happiness, and the wrong view of self-identity, self-existence. So the way that we overcome these three is through cultivating the recognition that all things are anicca, impermanent, dukkha, unsatisfying, and anatta, impersonal. So not a persistent true self. And that whatever we think we are, so whatever identities or labels we put on ourselves, whatever we think we are, is also anicca, dukkha, anatta. It's impermanent, so it's subject to change, and in fact it's already changing. It's dukkha, so it's unsatisfying. It's not a true source of happiness. And it's anatta, which means it's not who we really are. So then we can start talking about what gender is. Well, what is gender? Fundamentally, gender is a set of expectations or assumptions about the way a person should behave, should appear, their roles in status or behaviors within society or in relationship to other people. So then what is it, what's the relationship that this has to the practice of Buddhism? Well, it's actually summarized quite simply in the Soma Sutta. So the sutta from which Aya Soma gets her name. So in the Soma Sutta, it says, if one thinks I am a woman or I am a man or I am anything at all, then one is subject to Mara's control. So Mara being the personification of delusion. So this is simply pointing to the fact that if you say I am anything, fill in the blank, doesn't matter what it is. So in the Soma Sutta, it's specifically targeting the idea of male and female, woman and man. But it also gives this broad statement, anything at all. So any identity whatsoever. If you say I am this, fill in the blank, then that's anicca, dukkha, anatta. So it's subject to change. So right now you think I am short. Well, wait a while, you might get taller or you might get shorter. That might happen too. So it's anicca. And it's also dukkha. If you get attached to that identity, well, that's going to be a problem. You're going to suffer as a direct result. And it's also not ultimately who you are, because it can change. Then it's not who you really are. Something that's a temporary experience, but not your true nature, not your true essence. You think, I am young. Well, again, wait a little bit, that changes. And if you're attached to the identity of being young, well, that's going to cause a lot of suffering when it changes, which it's already changing. And of course, it's not who you are. Sometimes you're young, and sometimes you're middle-aged, and sometimes you're old. And then it starts all over again. So clearly that's not who you are. It's just a temporary experience. So the same also goes for genders. So if one says, I am a woman, or I am a man, or I am anything, well, it's anicca, can change. It's dukkha, it's unsatisfying. So if you hold on to that identity, then that causes suffering, it causes pain. And it's also not who you ultimately truly are. So one of the central standpoints of Buddhism is that we've all lived countless lives. And over the course of those countless lives, we've sometimes been women, and sometimes men, and sometimes other things, which don't fit in either category. And it's always changing from life to life. It's not always the same. In fact, we've been everything at one point or another. So it's clearly not who we are. So maybe right now we identify as a particular gender, or other people identify us as a particular gender. But in past lives, it's been different, and in future lives, it will be different. And even in this life, it might change. So someone's gender can change even in the course of one life, let alone over the course of countless lives. And again, what do we actually mean by gender? So we can talk about physiological characteristics, or we can talk about psychological characteristics, or we can talk about cultural characteristics, or we can talk about any aspect that one wants to talk about. But all of it ultimately is under what we call sankhara. So sankhara is a construct. It's a conditional phenomenon. It's something which, by its very nature, is unstable and temporary. And it's something which, by its very nature, is artificial. So sankhara literally means construct. So it's a sankhara, by its very nature, is artificial. So also looking at how we define gender, so much of it is arbitrary and varies dramatically from time to time and place to place. Yeah, even varies dramatically from person to person. So this also is pointing to the inherently empty nature of these things. So what is it that one person means when they say woman or man or otherwise? And what is it somebody else means when they say these words? Well, it can actually be quite different. There's not necessarily a universal standard for these things. So this is why, again, in Buddhist practice, we're not necessarily taking the concept of male and female too seriously, because we're recognizing that ultimately these have no meaning. The meaning of them is something which is a temporary artificial construct, which we can either choose to participate in or choose to not participate in. But either way, it doesn't have anything to do with the actual truth of reality. And as long as we're holding rigidly to any one perspective on gender, whether our own or somebody else's, then that's ultimately an obstacle to awakening. It's just a few brief introductory words on the topic. Would you like to pick it up from here?
All right, thank you, Bhante. I'm a big fan of the Soma Sutta, which is why I also was named after that, actually, thanks to Bhante Suddhasa, who told my 780 preceptor back in the day. And yeah, it's very helpful, of course, to understand everything that Bhante said, to understand that ultimately nothing is really our atta, nothing really can be precisely who we are. But I find it also helpful to bring to mind the sort of distinction that we we do we talk about a lot in Buddhist practice, which is the difference between conventional reality and ultimate reality. And of course, in ultimate reality, and of course, a mind of an enlightened being has fully realized the emptiness of all things, has fully realized the emptiness of attas. But between here and there is a bit of a walk, right? There is a path, and there's a path full of attas. And one of those attas is also the atta of gender that we need to deal to one degree or the other. And so it's very important to have a healthy sense of any type of atta, and also a healthy sense of the atta of gender before we toss it out the window. It's important to understand what is our current present understanding of our atta of gender, and also how it's constantly changing too, perhaps. And then if it's not, at a healthy sort of stage, also creating the conditions in order to get to a good supportive state. And this applies to pretty much every single kind of identity that we have. We need to understand it fully in order to understand what we're dealing with, instead of trying to get to pretend that we're enlightened. Like, I have no self, I have no self, I have no self. No self, no self, no self, no self. No, it doesn't really work that way. So that's not how the Buddha attained awakening. If it would have been just as easy as that, then he wouldn't have spent that much time teaching us. But getting back to the atta of gender, I think it's actually a really interesting atta, because it's really controversial. There are so many different attas, as I was mentioning. And actually recently I was talking with Bhante Sudaso. So currently I hold two passports, the Italian passport and the American passport, but I define myself as Italian, and I'm very unwilling to define myself as American, even though Bhante Sudaso, the American, calls me American. And I'm like, no, I'm not American. And he's like, yes, you're American. And I'm like, no, I'm not American. He's like, but you have a pass, that's what we define as American. I'm like, no, I'm foreigner here. No, I'm not American. I'm Italian. I really feel Italian, And it's okay. I think if I actually just talk about that with people, to one degree or the other, whether I decide to identify as Italian or as American or as neither, or as both, even within Buddhist circles, people will not necessarily say, hey, you're attaching to that identity, or you should, that's not the Buddhist way. Like, we don't really think too much about the identity, for example, of nationality. But whenever someone questions anything about the gender, for example, assigned at birth, there seems to be like this big, buckets of anatta that are kind of freely shared. That one is not a good Buddhist practitioner because they're questioning whatever has been assigned to them at birth. So I find it very interesting, and it speaks more about actually the people that have problems with it, which is 99.9% of people apparently in the world, than of the people who are actually questioning the atta that was given to them. And so what is it? I would say that is one question that we should all have, regardless of our identification, regardless of how people identify us, regardless of whether we think we're Buddhist, 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 none of the above, like whatever it is. Why is it so triggering? Why is this so infuriating? Why is this such a big deal? So we can't really toss something out if it's clearly something so charged. So especially actually last week, 2 weeks ago, I can't remember, I gave a talk that was along those lines on particular LGBTQIA plus identities. And it was very interesting to see all sorts of different questions from people who are not identifying as LGBTQIA+, but we're really triggered by other people's identities. And I was like, why are you not triggered by your own identity, your own cis identity, whatever, cis hetero identity? So actually that, I would say, something that one should question to begin with. What does that mean? Precisely, actually, also I appreciated how Bante started the talk by talking about definitions. Well, let's define all of our identities, and let's also do this analysis of looking of why and how, what is so that we, that we feel so strongly about. And the other thing is also, what are our expectations on others based on what we think their gender is, and how does that, even our gender assigned at birth, how does that impact our thoughts, our behaviors, our decisions? There's so many different consequences that come just by having a particular body and being received by others in a particular way, whether we identify with that body or not. And also, there's, anyway, lots of questions to investigate more than answers, I would say. That is quite interesting. Would be actually helpful if you all, friends that are checking in and saying hello, would actually ask questions or comments, because that makes it more interesting. And also all of you here present today, we have many residents, so anyone who wants to chip in would be great. There is one question from TJ. Hi, so what is your favorite verse or role model in the Therigatha? Hearing from the recent video, congratulations on your new book about the Therigatha. I love your beautiful, okay, you're very kind. What is your favorite verse or role model in the Therigatha? Well, actually, the Soma Sutta, where I get my name from. So, but I first encountered it actually in the Bhikkhuni Samyutta. Interesting fact, actually, the Therigatha was one of the last parts of the canon that I read and delved into. Even though that was a very interesting thing, actually, speaking of gender, when I started my Buddhist practice and I was hanging out with other Buddhists, every so often, like, people would just give me this Therigatha book, and they were like, oh, yeah, you would definitely want to read this. It's women writing from the past. And I was like, okay. And I hadn't actually connected the dots. I'm a little bit, I was just found it very bizarre. The reason, it's like, woman, you must be interested in this. But actually, I was just not interested in poetry. So I was like, I was just not really into the poetry thing. So it took me a while, actually, also because at the very beginning, I hadn't realized that women weren't, there weren't too many examples of women in general, actually. Well, in Buddhism, like in the Pali Canon, but also like my entire life, apparently, up until Buddhism, I was in this bubble. So I always identified with, Kierkegaard or like Dostoevsky or like, or whoever it was. Also Anais Nin, but it never occurred to me, oh, Anais Nin is a woman. So I can only identify with Anais Nin, but Dostoevsky, I can't really identify with him because, well, yeah. So that was kind of also how I was relating to the Pali Canon at first. And so I was more relating to it as with the genre of poetry, not terribly interested. But then, aside with the idea of like, oh, you like things written by women, I was also presented with other ideas like, oh, women cannot attain awakening or have a harder time or have this and that, or a bunch of different stereotypes that exist unfortunately in Buddhist circles. And that's when I started becoming a little bit more interested in what actually was present in the text, what was related to whether we want to define it as sex or gender, which actually in the latest studies that I'm doing, there's a book, I can't remember now on the top of my head the name of the author, but actually he was highlighting how, our concepts of sex and gender today are very different from also how it was presented in ancient India and also in different cultures in Asia. So sometimes it overlaps, so sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it's something completely different. So also, when we get into this terminology, it's very useful, as Bhante Sudaso said, to always define it. Otherwise, we think we're talking about the same thing, but most often than not, actually, we don't. Or we tend to apply, our whatever we think is taboo in either our culture or our society right now, or even in our head. Then we also tend to create definitions of Pali words that we find in both Dhamma Vinaya that, might put us off track. So, getting back to your question, though, my favorite verse and role model in the Therigatha was Soma, also because it was just also a relief. I was really, after being bombarded so much with so many expectations and ideas on whatever my body meant for so many people, and how it had many expectations on my spiritual practice, I remember reading her verses. What does womanhood have anything to do at all when the mind is concentrated well and sees right through Dhamma? One who thinks I'm a woman, I'm a man. Or anything at all is fit for Bana to address. And I remember reading those verses and going, yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. Seriously, what's wrong with you people? So I was very happy with Bhikkhuni Soma's verses. So up to this day, still my favorite. Okay, great. A lot of fun questions have popped up. So Lizzie says, hello, I'm a trans woman and practitioner. One thing that occurs to me constantly with regard to your gender is just attachment attitudes from Buddhists, is that they seem much more attached to my identity than I am. Thank you very much. I find it interesting and more than a little sad.
I would also point out, it's not just that they're more attached to your identity than you are. It's also that they're very attached to their own identity and attached to identities in general. So this is another thing which needs to be pointed out, is that pretty much everybody in the entire world is extremely attached to their gender identity. It's just that they think that's normal and acceptable. And it's true, it is normal and it is acceptable. And it's also an obstacle to awakening. So just because something is normal or common or socially acceptable does not mean that it's going to help you attain awakening. In fact, if doing what was normal and common and socially acceptable led to awakening, the world would be populated entirely by Buddhas. So just want to point that out. Just a little reminder there. So yeah, the vast majority of people in the world are very attached to their gender identities. So whether they identify as male or female or otherwise, whether their identity matches their physical body or not, whether it matches their birth assigned gender or not, none of that really matters. The point is that the vast majority of people are extremely attached to their own gender identity. And yeah, so if somebody is born with a male body and thinks I am a man, well, congratulations, you're not getting awakened. If somebody is born with a female body and identifies I am a woman, congratulations, you're also not going to get awakened. So it doesn't matter whether somebody's gender identity matches their body at birth or not. The point is that if you have a rigid gender identity, then that's going to prevent you from attaining awakening. But what's also interesting, as Ayasoma was alluding to earlier, when people with a rigid concept of gender encounter others with a different approach, then that can often be felt as threatening. So it's actually similar to, for example, if someone has a rigid religious standpoint and they encounter someone of a different religion, it can be threatening. Or a rigid political standpoint. Like if someone's really staunch advocate of a particular political party and they meet someone who's a staunch advocate of a different political party. Well, this difference of views then leads to conflict. Well, similarly, you've got someone who believes firmly in what man means and what woman means and what men are supposed to be like and what women are supposed to be like. And then they meet somebody who has a different perspective. That can be very upsetting, very challenging, very difficult for that person to accept. So one of the things that we're cultivating in Buddhism is a fluidity with views. So there's many places in the suttas where the Buddha says that we should not rigidly adhere to our opinions. We should not obstinately stick to only my view is right and every other view is wrong. But rather, we should always be open to the possibility that our opinions are wrong, our viewpoints are wrong. We should also be open to the possibility that we may have a completely false concept of reality, and that we need to alter or even flat out discard our opinions about things. So actually, one thing that Ayasoma was pointing out recently is that someone who has a more fluid approach to gender identity may then find it easier to investigate and let go of attachments around gender. And also, by extension, then attachments to identities in general. Yeah, so of course, yeah, people say your gender is just attachment, and you can say right back to them, well, so's yours. Have you thought about yours?
Yeah. In fact, in the Samyuga Sutta, actually, the Buddha says as much. And he doesn't, he's not talking about trans people necessarily. He's just talking about people and how we identify essentially with our gender. And there's nothing physical about it. There's not one characteristic that is physical, that is body. In the Samyuga Sutta, whenever he talks about all the ways through which we identify with, quote unquote, the feminine or the masculine, he never once says that there's any specific body part, but it's actually identical, the framework that he uses to essentially define attachment to femininity as attachment to masculinity. No different. The only term that switches is masculinity and femininity. And that's, it's just such an incredibly insightful sutta when you start seeing. Also, actually, there's a word play because the different even words that he picks. Can't think of them on the top of my head right now, but they all had the sense, kind of like kanda, like a sort of construct that doesn't really have any kind of substance altogether. And so he was not giving this teaching just to trans people saying, hey, look at how attached you are. Not like those cisheads, they're not attached at all. It makes no sense, right? But actually how it's the process of unawakened beings to attach to gender. So when I say things like how Bhante was, I guess, quoting me on it, I would feel that, yeah, absolutely. If someone has transitioned, first of all, I think they're already a step ahead, because they're actually questioning something that was assigned to them at birth. Buddhist practice is all about questioning our like assumption of reality. So when someone gives you, tells you, by the way, you are this gender, blah, blah, or you are supposed to do this and that, blah, blah, blah. And you start questioning it. Well, that's great. You're already in the process of looking at it and, unwrapping that onion. So of course, absolutely. I remember as a journalist, and I spoke about it already in the other week at the other talk. When I was a journalist in my previous life, within this life, I actually started interviewing. I did a reportage on trans men. It was really interesting, people who were assigned female at birth that had transitioned. And in particular, I remember this trans man who was a African American, and he was describing to me how, his entire experience had shifted, because all of a sudden people were sometimes scared of him, when he was maybe in the elevator with a bunch of other people, and he was not used to people being intimidated by him, or conversely, other people taking him more seriously than what he was used to before. And he was quite frank with, his new realm of experience that to a certain degree, like, was making him more comfortable with his body. But at the same time, then there were also some other side effects that hadn't been foreseen. And that's incredible. All of a sudden you see dependent origination right there. Like, how is that affecting who you think you are? And that is essentially the atta. It's not about, this and that, but rather realizing how every single atta that we have is dependently arisen. It's not ours. Doesn't belong to us, but it's rather the product of causes and conditions. Some we can identify, some we can't, because maybe they're from previous lives as well. But still, once we start realizing that, then we're doing the practice of that the Buddha is pointing out. So I would say that in general, that has been my experience. And Sud says, in lay life, venerables, we have many gender roles. How should one approach these roles?
As utter nonsense.
A little uncompromising, but
I consider that one of my good traits, for the record. Yeah, seriously, who comes up with this nonsense? Men should do this, women should do this. Why? Says who?
I would say, how would one approach them? Lightly. Because sometimes we can't escape them in particular circumstances. So, not to take them, okay, well, this is my, I don't know why I have like now the image of the cross, kind of like the Via Crucis. We have it in Italy a lot. We do like bearing the cross, like this is the gender role that currently now they're throwing at me, and I'll have to like endure. But we can take it lightly, or learn how to take it lightly sometimes when it's there, and sometimes use it skillfully. Sometimes it can be actually a way through which we can actually speak to many people who are holding, one particular identity. That, for example, is something that I find really beautiful in actually being a bhikkhuni and having this form, how so many people will sometimes identify with me, even though in my mind we have nothing in common except for something that was assigned to us at birth, right? But we have completely different cultures. We are completely different parts of the world, age groups, age ranges. And it's mind-boggling that people identify with me without even knowing me. Like, they're just happy to see me. When I went to Thailand, for example, I was really amazed on how powerful having a body that looks like this and has a particular gender role is able to communicate so many things to so many people. So yeah, that could be a great thing. And at the same time, of course, it comes with big baggage. So the baggage can be the but maybe if we also look at the pros, then we can hold it lightly, and it can also be a skillful means.
Yeah, I'm still remembering when your mom was here recently. It was about a couple times a week. She would comment. She would be like, "Oh, these men in the monastery, they're great. They cook, they wash dishes, they sweep the floors," and I'm just like, "Yeah, that's like what you do. That's how you live."
My mom is a little on the older side, and Italy was a little bit behind the United States, I feel. So there's the gender roles have been a little bit more marked for a longer time than perhaps in this country.
I remember thinking, like, but then who would do the cooking and who would sweep the floors? Like, do the men just like slowly starve to death in filthy buildings?
Yes, it's a true story. I've seen it multiple times. It'd be a great documentary.
Men starving to death in dirty rooms.
I mean, it's also quite interesting. Okay, maybe I would be oversharing. So, for the sake of when in doubt, shut it out. I will not share. Okay, so
we just took that.
Sorry, unicide theory. Dear Venerables, so what have you struggled with the most in monastic life? Loss, greed, aversion, envy, etc. But this is not necessarily with gender.
It's off topic, so I think we can save that for monk chat tomorrow.
But I'll make it about gender. So the answer is gender. What have you struggled with the most in monastic life? Gender. Perfect. Sud said, also Venerables, what is your opinion on reminding oneself sabbe sankhara anatta? In my experience, this has been somewhat freeing through, of course. It's not a direct realization. Should one not do this?
Well, first off, you misspelled both sankhara and anatta, but that's a side point. No, actually, it's a great practice. Constantly reminding that everything we're experiencing is impersonal. That this body is not my true self. These feelings are not my true self. These perceptions are not my true self. These thoughts are not my true self. This consciousness is not my true self. Constantly reminding yourself in this way is a practice that the Buddha recommends all throughout the suttas. So actually, it's a very powerful way of constantly reminding yourself not to stick self-identity onto things, because we have such a deeply rooted habit of selfing everything that we need some kind of reminder to stop selfing everything, because nothing is personal, nothing is self. And yet we make everything all about me and myself and who I am and what I am. And that's why we suffer all the time. So actually, I think it's great, constantly reminding yourself, sabbe sankhara anatta. Yeah, that's great. You can also go through it piece by piece. The eye is not me. The ear is not me. The nose is not me. The tongue is not me. The body is not me. The mind is not me. Or you can do the 5 khandhas, as I said a moment ago. The body is not me. Sensations are not me. Perceptions are not me. Thoughts are not me. Consciousness is not me. So going through in this way, it's actually a very powerful way of shifting our habits of mind. So yeah, I say keep it up. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I would tie it up once again with the encouragement of actually seeing how we personalize everything. So, for example, like when the train is late, we're like, oh, everything, they have it all against me, or like, oh, like the traffic, and there's so much traffic, or the plane, is is canceled. Everybody, the world hates me. Like we just personalize everything, even things that are obviously not personal. So looking at how we personalize things gives us an insight, better insight in how impersonal all things are. And then it's easier, at least for myself, to do the recollection of, all things are impersonal, or things are not, who I am. I don't need to hold on to this. It's kind of like just understanding this is how things are. And Kumu says, Dear Venerables, I'd like to think that our physical body is just a vehicle to support the pancha khandhas. Is that thinking in line with the teachings?
Not quite. The physical body is, well, actually, fundamentally, it's a mental experience, which is the product of our past karma. We want to be really precise about things. And it's not a vehicle that supports the panchakanda. It's one of the 5 khandhas. It's part of the panchakanda. But people take their bodies way too seriously. It's just a walking chunk of meat. It's a bloody chunk of meat wrapped in skin, leaking from multiple orifices. This is how it's defined in the suttas, by the way. So I'm not making these things up. A leaky bag of bloody meat. Why do we take it so seriously? And why do we care that some leaky meat bags are shaped slightly differently than other leaky meat bags? Like, why do we make such a big deal about these things?
Good morning, Venerables. What gender are you? Do you yourselves identify as?
Well, personally, I try not to identify as anything at all. But other people usually think I'm a male.
Yeah, other people usually think I'm a woman. That's all.
Okay, moving on.
Well, it's more that it's just really interesting. I always thought more about like my nationality more than my gender. I feel really strongly, about being Italian. And other things too. But even there, now that I go back to Italy, I'm like, I'm not really quite Italian. This is really weird. So that's also dukkha and anatta and anicca. But I'm more interested in understanding the implications of the gender identity that people place on me and how that affects my atta, rather than at this point, I'm not particularly interested in talking about my gender identity per se. And Bill Stewart is a big fan of Bhante Sudaso's candor, and so says, don't stop your candor.
I think that includes you too. You're also pretty blunt.
Oh, am I? Oh.
Yeah.
I'm Italian.
Yeah, I have no excuse.
And Kevin says, why is that the monastic code is significantly longer for women than men? Also, I have heard for several male monks of homophobia in the communities. How is this being addressed? So, do you want to?
Well, starting with the second question. So the truth is that homophobia has been pretty common pretty much everywhere. Well, not everywhere, that's not true. In some cultures in human history, it's actually been perfectly normal and completely accepted. But in many human cultures, homophobia has been a pervasive problem and continues to be in many human cultures. So it's not surprising that also in some monasteries you find problems with homophobia. So it is, of course, fundamentally, homophobia is opposed to the Buddha's teachings. It's not something which is supported by the Buddhist teachings in any way. But once again, if everybody was actually perfectly enacting the Buddha's teachings, then the world would be full of enlightened beings by now. So even in monasteries, you will find people who are not following the Buddha's teachings perfectly. And that's unfortunate, but it's not something to be surprised by. So when people enter monasteries, they bring with them all of their pre-existing biases, opinions, cultural conditioning. And that doesn't all go away right away. In fact, it might persist to one degree or another for their entire monastic life, even to the point where they're maybe starting a monastery of their own. So it's not surprising that sometimes non-Dhamma or even anti-Dhamma viewpoints can be pervasive in certain segments of the Buddhist population and even in Buddhist monasteries. So it's unfortunate, but it's not surprising. And of course, there's many monasteries where it isn't a problem. There's many monasteries where the monastics really don't care one way or another what somebody's sexual leanings are. It doesn't really matter at all. And also in monasteries, we're usually practicing celibacy, so it actually quite literally really doesn't matter at all. Do you want to talk about his comments on the monastic code?
Yeah, well, first of all, this is one of the frequently asked questions, actually, and there's always kind of like usually a negative connotation when it comes from people who are not born Buddhist. So I'll tell you actually a story of some Thai friends when they first met me, and I was the first bhikkhuni that they met. So there were some other people there, and they're like, oh, so I think there was an anagarika, so like, oh, you're on the 8 precepts. Oh, sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Then there was a samanera. You're on 10 precepts. Oh, sadhu, 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 sadhu. And how many precepts are you unvetterable? And I'm like, 311. They're like, oh, wow, sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. I have a hard time with 8. Only once a year, sadhu. More than the bhikkhus. Wow. Incredible. And that's because there's a value, respect for precepts. It's something good. It's incredible. If you go to Burma, actually, they have the bhikkhus, they weren't content with 227. So they added like commentaries with the commentaries and commentaries. They have 3,000. So they actually have more than the bhikkhunis. Yeah, it's, the one-upping. My sila is better than yours. So first of all, it's interesting to see how we're approaching ourselves to the concept of precepts to begin with. So actually, as someone who decided to take full ordination because I love precepts, I'm actually quite happy that I have more precepts. And also, there's different reasons why there's different precepts, but brief outline, while there's, even though the communities are both the bhikkhu and bhikkhuni Sangha create the Sangha, they were somewhat kind of existing as parallel communities. So it's not that the Buddha first of all, the Buddha did not ordain people and had, hey, now this is like the full precepts that you have, like this is the book, read it, kind of like happens these days, but rather it was each precept was given as monastics were being naughty and doing a bunch of infractions. So it so happens, for example, that the bhikkhunis were a little bit obsessed with cloth. So there's like lots of precepts on cloth, more precepts than in the Bhikkhu Vinaya on particularly how to share cloth amongst the Bhikkhuni Sangha. Then there are some other precepts that, like, for example, some that are the same, but one bhikkhu precept will be 10 bhikkhuni precepts, because the bhikkhus like just broke everything possible, imaginable, all at the same time, as opposed to like, the bhikkhunis were, instead of breaking this glass with one shot, they would break one piece, then with the other piece, and the other piece, and the other piece. So it was addressed in like different times. And then there are some actual precepts that are there to protect actually the bhikkhunis from falling into the gender roles that were expected from them. So for example, bhikkhunis cannot do the laundry for bhikkhus, but bhikkhus can do the laundry for bhikkhunis. I can't pour water and fan bhikkhus as they're talking, but I can have water and be fanned by a bhikkhu, no problem. So there are cute things like that that the Buddha gave to us. So yes, there's different reasons. And Sud asks, dear Aya, you would have been Roman or Etruscan if you were born 2,750 years ago. Yes, also possibly Greek, because actually I was born in the south of Italy. So at some point it was actually under the Greeks. Must be the Greek nose. And Unisite says, I recall there was a rule where bhikkhunis must bow to monks regardless of seniority. Is this still practiced? If so, how does the general Sangha feel about the rule? Fun fact, actually, it's not a precept. It's not in the Bhikkhuni Vinaya. It's not one of those 311. But it's this thing that magically appears twice. One in the Nikayas and one in the Vinaya Pitaka. And it's also one of those suttas that is in all the different editions of the Pali Canon. So like in the Mahayana Canon, etc. It's always like very different from the others. So there is unanimous understanding that actually the Garudhammas, so the heavy rules, as they call them, they are clearly not the words of the Buddha, and clearly something that was manufactured later on, because Buddhism is a really inconvenient religion in the way that the Buddha established both orders. And there was there was not that hierarchy that people were expecting there to be. So then unenlightened people later on, probably me in my previous life, within this life, after being a Greek person, I was reborn in ancient India, and I was like, let me oppress those bhikkhunis. Ha ha ha, because I am a male.
It will be for all eternity.
Yeah.
In every future life.
And
so as I was mentioning, most contemporary scholars have concluded that the Garudhammas are clearly apocryphal, partly for the reasons that she was mentioning, but also because they directly contradict material that's found elsewhere in the Vinaya Pitaka. So when you come across dozens of places where it says one thing and then one place where it says something different, then you can safely conclude that the part that stands out is probably not authentic. So the Garudhammas are, these days, they're pretty widely regarded as being apocryphal, false, not real. Are they still practiced? It varies from place to place. Some places do, some places don't. Here at Empty Cloud, we don't follow those rules because we don't believe they're real. How does the general Sangha feel about it? It's always hard. It's always problematic to make generalizations about the Buddhist monastic world because it's highly disorganized. And each monastery will tend to have its own particular procedures and its own ways of doing things. Yes, I don't recommend making big generalizations about these things. You'll see a lot of different approaches.
Yeah. And just to clarify that we don't follow them here at Empty Cloud Monastery. How does one's lust relate to one's gender? From your practice, is the targeting of lust a natural or nurtured orientation? Ante?
To be perfectly honest, I haven't actually seen any correlation between lust and gender. People of any gender seem to be subject to lust. Seems to be a pretty common condition. As for is the targeting of lust a natural or nurtured orientation? That's not a distinction that we make in Buddhism. So rather what we do is we talk about the unfolding of cause and effect over both short periods of time and long periods of time. So for example, in the Dvaita Vitakka Sutta, the Buddha says, whatever one repeatedly directs the mind towards, that will become the natural inclination of the mind. So in other words, you can actually train yourself to have particular mental behaviors. In fact, that's what Buddhism is all about. It's about training your mind to have wise behaviors that lead towards awakening. But actually, we've been spending countless lifetimes training our mind to have unwise behaviors. So what we call natural, so something that just seems to already be there when you're born, that would be something that's the product of what you've been doing in previous lifetimes. So, for example, if in a previous lifetime you were spending a lot of time doing things with men, then maybe in this lifetime, regardless of what kind of body you're born with, you still have a strong attraction towards male bodies. So doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your body, but rather with the tendency that you've built up over previous lifetimes. For example, or people who actually they're attracted to many kinds of bodies. Well, once again, that's just their development of mind over lifetimes. So this distinction between natural and nurtured is not really a distinction that we have in Buddhism. Rather, we talk about karma and vipaka. That's what we talk about. Anyway, those are my thoughts.
Thank you. And also I want to specify that the Buddha was completely unconcerned with the gender of the people that we want to have sexual intercourse with, in the sense that all he's interested in, all the kind of directions that he's ever given is, well, for monastics to be celibate, but for lay people simply not to harm. So essentially, as long as the people in the relationship are consenting, then there's no problem. The Buddha is not concerned in people procreating. The Buddha is not concerned in people getting married or divorcing, whether it's same gender, opposite gender, like doesn't matter. He's completely unconcerned with that. All he's concerned with is do not harm others. So it's as simple as that. So when we get into natural, nurtured, all of those are so many different assumptions that we should look into what we think is, what is natural, what is nurtured, what is this natural thing that we think we're doing. Because actually the whole Buddhist practice is really not natural. I mean, we go against the stream. So like more natural than that. And Sud says, Dear Venerables, from what I have seen, those who don't follow gender roles in society end up causing themselves more suffering. Since I guess they would be going against the tide, wouldn't it make sense to just follow one's gender role as to decrease one's suffering? As I was mentioning earlier, we are trying to go against the stream. So one of the daily recollections that, sorry, Sue, the wrong audience. I mean, look, do we look like we're like trying to follow society? Wrong crowd. So one of our daily recollections is that we're no longer part of this social hierarchy. We no longer have worldly aims and values. So this is as monastics, but also as lay people. Honestly, it shouldn't be the aspiration to conform necessarily, but rather to have to practice in accordance with Dhamma, not to practice in accordance to whatever the local culture tells you that you're supposed to be doing. Also, when it comes to gender roles, by the way, in a globalized world, you're going to have a really schizophrenic realm of existence. It's going to be a lot of suffering if you try to be whatever, they tell you, oh, you're a male in the United States, you're supposed to be doing this. Then you go to Italy and it's another thing. And then you go to another. Actually, the Italian thing is great. It's a great example. For example, Italian Americans here, I noticed that it's like there's this whole machismo in Italian American communities. But usually Italian Americans are born in this country, right? So they get all these cues of like what it means to be, a man based on these American standards, which means basically, kind of like not washing yourself and like wearing really baggy things and I don't know, whatever it is. And then they go like, oh, now I'm going to go to the motherland, and Italy has this like whole machismo thing. And then you go there and like all these really strongly cis het men with their like plucked eyebrows and tight jeans and like going hand in hand and like how do you say with the arm in arm. I grew up with that, so for me it's completely normal. And they're like scandalized, like, whoa, the entire country is gay. So yeah, like this is this hilarious thing about all these gender roles and our expectations, and you try to fit in, you're gonna like go insane. Honestly, that was also like very bizarre for me as a female monastic, like entering Buddhism. I was used to like my kind of gender stereotypes probably in Italy, and I didn't like think too much about it. But then once I started going in all different places, it's also very interesting how even you're placed, in Italy, like the whole idea, ladies first. Oh, like, you're poor and like helpless. So I kind of liked it because people would carry my suitcase. It's kind of nice that that form. They would put you, like, oh, in the car, you go in the front, the lady has to go in the front. Then you go to Thailand and you're always in the back. And you are the one who brings the suitcases. I was like, oh, this is really bizarre. So yeah, what kind of gender role are we supposed to fit? Even if you're trying to be a woman, it can be very schizophrenic. Schizophrenic, right?
Schizophrenic, I think.
Confusing. So yeah, it's a lot of increasive suffering. So
Go ahead.
Just better to follow the Dhamma, just see what the Buddha says. And that's what we need to follow, not whatever kind of gender stereotypes.
The other thing is, I would just say that following gender roles just because those are the roles that you're told matches your gender, that's actually just building up your identity. It's building up that sense of self. So that's actually counterproductive to awakening. So you don't want to make the problem worse. So rather it's recognizing that, again, gender roles are arbitrary. You're not under any obligation to follow them. But rather, as Ayasoma said, you should just be practicing the Dhamma. In every situation, we're looking to see what is the most wholesome thing to do, not what is expected of people with my gender. Rather, what is the most wholesome thing to do? And sometimes the most wholesome thing to do is to carry the luggage, and sometimes it's to have somebody else carry the luggage. But that has nothing to do with your gender.
Sadhu. And Stasia says, I read a book about Tara by Bokar Rinpoche. One section talks about Tibetan monastics who, after practicing Tara devotion for a long time, become more androgynous in appearance. Very beautiful to me. Yes, also actually, if you pay attention to all the iconography, for example, the Burmese iconography that, or at least not the most recent necessarily, like in Thailand, in Southeast Asia, but definitely the old school ones, they're all androgynous. Actually, a lot of like monastics sometimes think that we have a lot of refigurations of bhikkhunis. Even my parents, actually, they came here, they're not Buddhist, but they were like, oh, like who are all these like females? Because, like there's the Buddha that is always we all wear skirts. But also they were kind of curvy or like very androgynous. And so it was very interesting to me. And I really love it, the fact that you can never really tell. Or when we had the Indonesian Buddha statue, when it was first installed, the worker who was not Buddhist, he asked, so is the Buddha male or female? As he was installing it. And so I think that actually in the course of history, it was, I think the Buddha has transcended gender. I mean, we tend to like fixate on like, oh, the Buddha being male. And there are some suttas that where my previous self, like in my previous life was like very male, the Buddha, look at all these characteristics, male. But yeah, that's actually the product of an unenlightened mind and fixating so much on the leaking body, that aspect. It's inconsistent. So yeah, absolutely. That's what we're aiming at. We're not trying to become even more binary than where we started, but rather, definitely going towards more non-binary, more androgynous. I don't know if you want to add something. And Sood says, but then in your examples, let's say you chose to sit in front in Thailand, that might make them uncomfortable. Then if you don't sit in front in Italy, maybe you would be seen as acting strange. Is that not so?
I actually think it's good to sometimes make people uncomfortable because in the examples you're giving, that's actually a way to get people to question, like, why are they doing what they're doing? Why do they place so much importance on these arbitrary concepts? And actually, I remember one time in Italy, I was used to actually the very first time we went, I don't think you were ordained yet. You were still a layperson. So I was a monk. She was still a layperson. And I'm used to the monk goes in the front. So I went in the front seat, and then the Italian person who was driving the car, he was like, wait a minute, isn't the woman supposed to go in the front? And I was like, but isn't the monk supposed to go in the front? So that was an example of this kind of like clash of different expectations. So, but yeah, I mean, ultimately it doesn't matter whether I'm in the front seat or the back seat, who cares? Like, at least I'm in the car. But actually in the case of where you sit in Thailand, actually, I think it is important to start breaking up these things, because from one perspective, it's arbitrary, but from another perspective, it can be very psychologically damaging for people. So it's important to consider the psychological damage that can be caused by rigid adherence to gender roles. Again, this is not, it's not Dhamma to be doing something that's causing harm to other people. So yeah, this thing of always putting the women in the back, is that actually something which makes for social harmony? Or is it something that creates a sense of inferiority in some and a sense of superiority in others? And so generating senses of superiority and inferiority is harmful. It's not helpful. So I'm not a fan. If one is going to do gender segregation, which I'm also not a fan of, I actually prefer the Chinese monastery model, where you'll have like men on the left and women on the right, but they're at an equal standing. So the Thai model of like men in the front, women in the back, that's also the Islam model, by the way. I don't think so. I don't think that's the most healthy way to do things. Those are just my thoughts on the matter.
My thoughts are that it depends on the circumstance, and sometimes the appropriate response is to somewhat follow the expectations, and sometimes it's not the appropriate response. And if the appropriate response is to follow the expectations, but we see that it has negative effects on our mind, then to just not go in that particular place again. That is my current sort of way of navigating, or creating perhaps other places that are more welcoming, or more, that have different sort of dynamics where one doesn't need to be concerned with that particular issue. So it's not about necessarily, so there, I think there's a difference between following conventions and conforming. So we see that actually there are precepts in the Bhikkhu and Bhikkhuni Vinaya where we are essentially expected to a certain degree or the other, take into consideration the kind of social norms of where we live. And that's, once again, following convention, being polite. I think it's in the realm of courtesy. But then we're also not trying to conform. So to do something that, for example, are harmful just because essentially that's that is the trend of the day. Right? So if everybody starts expecting that monks hunt, we don't start killing just because that's, hey, I don't want to ruffle some feathers. Like, look at all these other monastics hunting and I'm not hunting. I better hunt too. Or like, look at everybody like using money, handling money. I better start handling money. Or like, that's
Catholic monks drink wine. Maybe we should start drinking wine too.
That's exactly, I don't think they hunt, but they
do animal, at least traditionally, they would do animal husbandry in some Catholic monasteries. So raising their own farm animals, which would also mean periodically killing their farm animals.
Okay.
So I don't think hunting per se, but killing animals as one way of producing food was something that was done in Catholic monasteries.
Yeah, so that's a perfect example. So that's, conformity is not the answer. And that's for monastics, but also for lay people. So that's, I think, what I'm trying to say in terms of understanding what is the appropriate response and checking our intentions and our motivations. Are we just trying to make a scene? Like, what's the purpose of, like, what are we trying to do here? Essentially, in that case, for example, if I just go and like sit in front in Thailand, where for first and foremost. So there is different situations where that could be both appropriate or inappropriate. But could both be a statement that could create some reflection, or could be something that instead it's hostile or like ungrateful or not polite. So there's, it's a whole process. So that's what's very interesting in terms of our path, is that we don't have a cut and paste, always this answer, this answer, this answer, this answer, but actually we have to reflect, and there's so many different causes and conditions that we need to take into consideration. And Jeff says, so do you feel that assumed gender identity forces people to limit their actions or thoughts, or that it requires people to do things they otherwise wouldn't do?
Not inherently. So people always have a choice what they're going to do. Whether you choose to limit yourself based upon some external list of expectations, that's a decision that you make. But it's not required. It's not, nobody's forcing you to do anything. You make your own decisions.
My perspective is that unquestioned gender identity forces people to limit their actions and thoughts. Prior to my Buddhist practice, there were lots of things. I always followed my likes. So like, I like to do this, I like to do that, I like to do this, I like to do that, I like to do this, I like to do that, I am this, I am that, I am doing whatever I want. But then actually it was very interesting with Buddhist practice, and also like living in a gender inclusive environment, I started noticing certain how do you say, traits based on gender, like that they were very common. Like, for example, the average bhikkhu, actually, without even becoming a bhikkhu, the average samanera, like ordained the day before yesterday, has no problem receiving things. Like, oh, here is a gift. Oh, see, he's already like, like, oh, thank you. The average female monastic is like, oh, no, not like a lot of dukkha in being at the receiving end. So at the very beginning, when I ordained, I was like, oh, I am the one who has such a hard time receiving. I am the one like who likes to give but not receive. Me. And then I was like, oh, look at all these like like similar traits with other people who look in that way. So then it occurred to me like, it's that essentially when you look in a particular way, since you're born, you're very, maybe, I don't know, in the United States these days, but definitely when I was born in Italy, there's definitely the conditioning. There's definitely a lot of like different people around you that have that expectation. So even though I was pretty unruly actually in Italy, and I was like, no, I don't want to do that. No, I don't want to do that. But still, it kind of builds up in your mind. So when you start seeing how that behavior is dependently arisen, then you start learning different things about yourself. Well, first of all, you have a glimpse of anatta. You're like, oh, I am not the one who is either generous or like, as in, not the one who is either like likes to give but not receive or whatever it is, but rather this behavior is arisen for this and this other reason. And yeah, it doesn't have to be this way. Or before I was like, oh, I love being behind the scenes. I still have that atta a little bit. But then I realized that actually the majority, 99% of people who looked like me really like to be behind the scenes. And conversely, the one who was, became a monastic the day before yesterday and happened to look in a different way had no problem being in front of the scenes. So yeah, so when you unquestion it, you think that it's who you are. So you are limited in one way or the other. So then you might even have a conceit of superiority if certain things are, approved, or a conceit of inferiority if certain things are not, approved in society and so forth. But essentially, you're not free because you are holding on to those attas. You really think you keep on pursuing them. You keep on like making them essentially true. But then when you start realizing, looking at them, then you can toss them. And instead of pursuing what you like, you actually can start pursuing what is beneficial, what is needed. So right now, what is needed? Well, it was needed to do a Sangha panel. It's a panel, so there can't be just one monastic. So what is needed is for me to be here. If I followed just my likes, I would not be here. But actually also doing this type of conversation, then it's good. It's great because it helps me investigate the Dhamma with Bhante, with other people. So it's great. So we're all progressing, making progress in the path. So yeah, it's good to investigate that. And that, I feel, is when we are truly looking at the atta and then understanding anatta.
It looks like that's the last question from online. Are there any questions from the residents here?
I was looking at the term Aya in the dictionary, or I just came across it. But I don't know if I read like a different spelling, but it didn't, like it meant sir.
It depends on what dictionary you're looking in, but the literal meaning of Aya is noble. And in the suttas, it's actually sometimes used as a term of address for men as well as for women. So these days it's used almost exclusively as a polite term of address for bhikkhunis. But at the time of the Buddha, it was also used for males.
Is the term Bhante used for female monastics?
There's some debate around that, but I actually haven't looked at the scholarly research on this. Have you looked?
A while back, I remember that, yes, there was someone who said that it was actually like not, the guy next door, like it was a senior monastic who had said that Bhante was also gender neutral. But I forgot to note which venerable had said that, which scholar, and I never actually had the time to look into the sources. So I can't say for sure, but it seems like it is. So, don't know. To be continued.
Any other questions?
I've got one. I took a book up yesterday, so unfortunately, I have a question now. The book, the section that I was reading, it cut lots of pieces together about what to do for a happy life, okay? And the part that I was reading was specifically between men and women. So there was a discourse, unfortunately I'm not going to know the names of them, but there's discourse about the 6 directions. And one of the directions is between man and wife. And the Buddha seemed to give very concrete examples of roles that both men and women should follow for a happy life. And in the other one, it was some king had asked for help from the Buddha because his new daughter-in-law was being terrible. And the Buddha sat down with her and said, all right, there are these 4 kinds of good ways that a wife should be, and there are these 4 types of bad ways that a wife should be. Which one do you want to be? So it seemed again like he was stepping out specific roles, and he was connecting roles for women, roles for men to happiness. So I just wanted to ask, how do you take that? I mean, okay, so there's like ultimate truth, and then there's like the truth in the lives that we live, but he seems to be advocating for very strict gender roles. So I just kind of wanted to have your thoughts on that.
Well, first off, I'd point out that the Buddha, when it comes to specific details like that, you'll find different things in different parts of the suttas. So clearly they're not absolutes. But also I would say, look at what's the underlying principle of what the Buddha is saying. So in the context of the relationship between husband and wife, for example, the basic principles that he's giving for both sides is to be respectful and supportive to your partner. Don't hoard things to yourself. So like one of the things he gives the example of is that the man should give all his money to the wife. I find it interesting that people tend to overlook that particular one. If we're following the Buddha's gender instructions specifically, that means the men need to give all their money to the woman, all of it, and let the woman manage all the money for the household. That's actually in the suttas, but people seem to quietly ignore that part. They like some of the other gender roles, but not that one. But what's the point there? Well, probably because then, as has been going on for thousands of years, the men were hoarding all the money. And so the Buddha's like, hey, come on, be nice to your wife. Share the money with your wife. Don't stockpile it to yourself. So again, what's the underlying principles here? It's not necessarily that the role of women is to control the money, but rather the point here is to be thoughtful and kind and respectful and courteous and supportive of each other. And also the case of the misbehaving daughter-in-law, that was similarly the point, is he was trying to get her to understand that she was behaving in a very selfish, harmful, unwholesome way, she was behaving in a way that was based on greed, hatred, and delusion, and it wasn't doing anybody any good. So these things need to be understood in the underlying principle, not to get caught up in the details. An example of this is the monastic rules. So we have a number of monastic rules, for example, around eating, which make a lot of sense in terms of how people ate in ancient India. So mixing rices and curries and eating it with your hands. Actually, they still do that in parts of India these days. But then you try to apply the same principles to, say, eating a cheeseburger. Doesn't really make any sense. Or you apply the same principles to French fries. Again, doesn't really make any sense. Or the same principle to a bowl of spaghetti. Doesn't really make any sense. So what's the underlying principle of these rules about eating? It's about eating in a way which is mindful, dignified, respectful. Not necessarily that you must do it in exactly the same way it was done in ancient India at that time. Okay.
Sure.
Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just highlighting once again the principles rather than the details, the nuts and bolts, and also that to me, the Buddha, when there are those types of suttas, he generally, like the message that at least I read through it is to make the most out of the conditions that you're in. So for example, in the case of the married, I remember that sutta vaguely, the one of the daughter that was given in marriage, and essentially they're like, it's not that she had other aspirations. She was just not in a happy marriage or something like that. But point being is, okay, you're going to be in this marriage. What are you going to do about it? You have two options. Either cultivate wholesome mind states or cultivate unwholesome mind states. And so it's always about karma and doing wholesome karma that is for your benefit and the benefit of others. Something wholesome that is, for the benefit of both, ideally, rather than cultivating unwholesome mind states of like, oh, this situation is horrible, I hate it, I don't want it, it has to stop, while still being stuck in that kind of situation. So rather than saying, hey, women should be doing this or men should be doing this, it's rather do the best that you can in order to practice the Dhamma wherever you are, which is why then you'll find different sort of suggestions, different kind of somewhat teachings if you just focus on the details throughout the suttas. It's not always copy and paste. Oh, women should all be like making food and taking care of children. Well, no, because he also ordained women. So, so clearly women, with the monastics, the Buddha says the opposite, like leave everything behind, So then you would be very confused if you're like, wait, so are women supposed to leave everything behind, or are they supposed to like be, mothers and caretakers? So there's all of that. That can be an interesting.
This is also why it's important to read all the suttas, because it is quite possible to pick little bits and pieces out of context and come up with a quite distorted concept of the Dhamma. But if you read all the suttas, then you'll get enough context to really understand what the Buddha is talking about. And we're just about out of time, and out of questions, so perfect stopping place.
And Scott is suggesting a new topic for the future, mental health identity. That's interesting. So we'll write it down, and I see. Maybe.
Okay. Well, if you want to record that, because I'm going to forget.
Yeah, and if you have any other requests, feel free to send us an email at info@emptycloud.org, and we'll try our best to discuss it. All right, so we can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And tomorrow evening, we'll have Aya Santashita, who will be tuning in from California and answering all your questions on Monk Chat. So we have a special Monk Chat. And Sud, we don't mind you asking any questions at all. Actually, keep them coming. They're all great. And yeah, we love questions. All right, may you be well and happy, and may all good things come to you. And tomorrow, remember, Sutta study at 8 a.m. New York City time.
Okay, see you next time.